It's good to see everybody here, especially on a day like this. So we all came out, and hopefully this will be an enjoyable treat for us during all the snowy weather. First of all, there are three things that I want to tell you in general about Zane Grey. One is that he was the first millionaire author. Now, sometimes when I have kids come in, and I'll say that to them, especially little ones, and I'll say, have you ever heard of a millionaire author? And lots of times I get the same answer. And you can guess, Dr. Seuss. Yeah, he's a millionaire author. But you know what? That's not all that uncommon today. But back when Zane Grey was writing, that was phenomenal, let me tell you. Another thing that I want you to know about him is that he was so popular at the time that he was writing that his books outsold every other book in the country except the Bible and the Boy Scout Handbook. And that was saying something as well. And the third thing that I'd like to let you know is that despite the fact that there were Western authors before Zane Grey came on the scene, and of course later, and you can probably name some of those, he is considered to be the father of the modern American Western novel. Excuse me. So those are three things to keep in mind about this particular man. And whether you've read his books or not, just let me tell you that as a person, as a character, as a personality, he was a lot more interesting than many of the characters that played a really important part in his story. So if you get around to reading his books, you know, kind of keep that in mind. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. He was born Pearl Zane Grey in Zanesville, Ohio on January 31st, 1872. He was the fourth of 5 children. Now, Pearl was a boy's name at the time. And lots of times people will wonder, well, how did he get that name? Well, a very popular color at the time, especially in clothing by Queen Elizabeth, or Queen Victoria, sorry, was pearl gray. And so some people think that, you know, that may have been where that particular name came from. He was the great-grandson of Colonel Ebenezer Zane, who cut the path known as Zane's Trace into Ohio. Now, in reward for Colonel Zane's service, he was given as a land grant 10,000 acres of land around what is now Zanesville, Ohio. And his family took root and grew there. And that's where Zane Grey, his great-grandson, was born. Now, Zane's father was an itinerant dentist, and he wanted Zane to follow in his footsteps. Now, an itinerant dentist was a little bit like a circuit preacher in that he traveled around from place to place doing dental work for people in different communities rather than have them come to visit him in an office. And when people knew that he was coming, they were very glad in some cases to see the tooth puller, because that's pretty much what dentistry was during those days. And if you wanted to be a dentist during those days, all you had to do was find a mentor, an apprentice. And if you did that, you could call yourself doctor. Well, Zane's father just really, really wanted him to follow in his footsteps. And so when Zane was 14 years old, his dad started taking him on these trips to different communities. And of course, if you want to apprentice, you have to practice. So Zane became a tooth puller, and by the time he was 16, he did so well that people who visited with Dr. Grey and Zane actually chose Zane to do their dental work. Okay. Dr. Lewis Grey was a harsh taskmaster who disapproved of Zane's love of fishing and making up action stories. He warned his son not to waste his time on any of this scribbling nonsense. Well, the scribbling nonsense was something that Zane had decided he liked to do from a very young age. One day when he was in the 5th grade, he came home with a story that he had written called Jim of the Cave. Well, there were caves around the area where he played, and that's probably where he got the idea. And Jim of the Cave was well enough written that he got a nice grade at school. And when he brought this story home to his dad, instead of getting a pat on the back, his dad just simply shook his finger at him, grabbed the paper, tore it up, and threw it away because he wasn't going to have any of this time wasting going on. Zane, called Pearl as a boy, enjoyed the new game of baseball, and he became a very capable pitcher. He could have pitched professionally were it not for rule changes that were implemented to accommodate the skill of another Ohio boy, Cy Young. And you can see Cy there in the far picture. The distance between the pitcher's mound and home plate was extended to give opposing teams a better chance against Cy's fastball. Now, Zane couldn't compete, and so he gave up his dream of a professional baseball career. I don't think his dad would have gone along with that one either. Another change of rule that shaped Zane's life was the one requiring newly practicing dentists to become college educated instead of merely apprenticing with a mentor. Zane's skill as a baseball player earned him a scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania to study dentistry. Now, he hadn't been a really good student in school so far, so you can imagine he wasn't thrilled about this. But, well, he had a baseball scholarship, so that was doable. While he was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, Zane played baseball on the school team, but he also played for money during the summer break. Now, playing for money was not permitted under pain of expulsion, but Zane, unlike some of his teammates, was never caught. He was an indifferent student, but he was able to complete a degree in dentistry, and he set up a practice in New York City. On a fishing vacation with his brother, Romer, on the Delaware River, Zane met Lena Elise Roth. Now, Lena, known as Dolly to her friends, was attending the normal school of the city of New York, and she planned to become a teacher. Now, when you hear the term normal school, that was another word at the time for a teacher's college. So if you're going to a normal school, that's what you were training to do. Zane, who by now had changed the spelling of his name from G-R-A-Y to G-R-E-Y to possibly distance himself from a scandal, and Dolly courted. They fell in love, and they married on November 21st of 1905. After several unsuccessful attempts at writing, Zane used Dolly's inheritance to travel to Arizona to visit Buffalo Jones, a rough adventurer, for inspiration. Now, this man gave lectures in the East, and he bragged that he was able to rope wildcats, mountain lions, and sell them to zoos. He didn't have to shoot them and hope that they recovered. He didn't have to trap them. He could rope them, he said. Well, most people didn't believe him, but Zane did. And on that promise, that is how that he made this trip, this safari. Now, at the time, the country's readers were hungry for stories about the West, and Zane's imagination was stimulated to provide those stories. So he traveled with Buffalo Jones all over the West, and he learned everything he could, and he took notes all the time. He learned about cowboys and Indians. He learned about settlers and ranchers and sheep herders. He learned about the geology and the geography. And all the time, he was sending all of these notes by letter back to Dolly, who was arranging them for him and exploring places where she might sell them. In 1903, Zane's novel, Betty Zane, met with an unfavorable response. But in 1912, Zane's most popular, best-selling novel, Riders of the Purple Sage, was published. It still has a lot of fame today. On October 1st, 1909, Romer, Zane and Dolly's first son, was born. Their daughter, Elizabeth, whom they called Betty Zane Grey, was born on April 22nd, 1912. And on November 20th, 1915, Zane and Dolly's son, Lauren, was born. Now, in this family story, Zane and Dolly are seated on the ground, and Dolly is holding Romer, and then Betty Zane, little Betty, is being held by her dad, and Lauren is not in this photo. Okay. Sound technology revolutionized the movie industry. When moviegoers could hear screen actors speak, they were excited to see Zane Grey's Western action stories brought to life. Zane and his family moved to Hollywood, California in 1918 when Riders of the Purple Sage, The Rainbow Trail, and The Border Legion were made into motion pictures. Now, at this time, studios were coming to Zane Grey and asking that they could make scripts from Zane's novels. Well, they offered $2,500 for each script that he would allow them to film. Well, that's a lot of money today. So you can imagine what a tremendous amount of money it was at that time. And of course, Zane said yes. However, he had two conditions. I guess you'd call this creative control. But he had two conditions, and the theater or the movie studios agreed. Number one, the action scenes would be shot on location. He wasn't going to have anybody sitting on a hobby horse rocking back and forth with somebody else pulling the scenery behind them, making it look like a horse was galloping along. Number two, no famous stars were to be cast in important roles in Zane's movies because he wanted his story to be the star, not a person. Well, if you look at the names, the famous names like Roy Rogers and Dale Evans and Eve Arden and Gabby Hayes, if you look at the names of those famous people, they became famous because they appeared in Zane's movies, not because they already were. All right, it's been said that Zane Grey wrote to finance his passion for fishing. In 1924, Zane bought his first fishing yacht, the Fisherman, in Nova Scotia. He sailed to the Panama Canal and the Galapagos Islands. Writing as he traveled, he earned more than $575 million from books, articles, and motion pictures. At home, Dolly continued to act as his editor and literary agent, publishing and promoting his career. Now, a lot of people, a lot of critics and scholars about Zane Grey really believe that without Dolly, Zane wouldn't have had nearly the success that he did. He never changed anything as he wrote. He just used a number 2 pencil, no eraser, and just simply wrote in large amounts of time without stopping. And when he was finished, that manuscript would go to Dolly. Dolly would sit down with a typewriter. She would pretty it up. She would make any corrections that needed to be done. She would then act as his editor and literary agent, and she would sell these manuscripts for him. All of that was taken out of his hands. Now, Zane fished and wrote in Tahiti, in 1925 through 1927. And then he purchased another yacht, the Fisherman II. He was well known in Australia, and he became famous as a big game fisherman, setting records in fishing tournaments. One of the things that you might wonder as I'm standing here and talking to you is, about this time period, Ernest Hemingway was also a very popular writer. And Ernest Hemingway loved to fish. So you would think that these two people would be, well, they'd have enough in common, they'd be close friends, but you would be wrong. Each one had a really strong ego. And each one claimed, and they had met each other, they didn't get along well, but each one claimed the other was jealous. Now, Hemingway insisted that Zane was jealous of his writing, which was probably true because Hemingway wrote literary fiction. And that was a completely different genre. Zane insisted that Hemingway was jealous of his fishing ability, which was also probably true. Now, you might think, or you might remember, The Old Man and the Sea, which was one of Hemingway's most famous novels. And you might remember the story of the old man going out to fish. Well, Zane tells a story about himself when he was fishing in a tournament and he caught a huge fish. And right away, the sharks started circling as he pulled and pulled it in. They took out chunks and bites. And when Zane went back to have this huge fish weighed for competition, he really insisted that the people who were doing the judging add back the poundage, just to be fair. Well, they wouldn't do it. But he complained loudly enough that people all around heard the story, including Ernest Hemingway. So if you read about the old man going out and the sharks taking pieces of his fish, you might say, that sounds kind of familiar. And it did. Okay. The Great Depression affected book and magazine sales. Dolly had trouble selling Zane's work. Zane continued to sail the South Seas, fishing and writing, while Dolly worked very hard to keep her family afloat. She managed the Grey finances from their home in Altadena, California. And she wasn't a financial wizard, but she did a pretty good job of keeping things going. In 1936, Zane suffered a heart attack and recovered in California with Dolly. He was able to recover enough to return to Australia to fish. But on October 23rd, 1939, Zane died of heart failure in Altadena. Upon his death, Zane had written 89 books and allowed 110 movie scripts based on his novels to be written. Now, they hadn't all been published at this time. Publishers aren't going to compete against themselves by releasing more than one book a year. That would be foolish financially. So when Zane died, there was a backlog of his fiction and nonfiction. And Dolly managed that as part of his estate. There were a few unfinished novels, and his son Lauren stepped in and finished them up. And he sort of got the bug, I think, because he wrote 2 or 3 of his own after that. But they were never as well received as his father's were. So the legacy continued for a long, long time after Zane had passed away. During his life, Dolly had provided the emotional support Zane needed to believe in himself and his work. After his death in 1939, she dedicated herself to preserving his life's work. She attended many events honoring her husband's achievements. Dolly helped to found the Zane Grey Museum in Zanesville, Ohio in 1952. 5 years later, at the age of 74, she died of cerebral hemorrhage. And at that time, Zane's estate was in the hands of his children, and then later his grandchildren. And they continue to manage it today. And there are societies around the United States that are involved in keeping the Zane Grey legacy, the Zane Grey mystique alive. The Zane Grey's West Society is one of those. And they do a very, very fine job of that. It's interesting to me that at the museum, we have people who come in from all over the world who have read Zane Grey novels. We had a visitor from Japan, and she was about my age, but she said when she was a little girl that her father would move heaven and earth to get her Zane Grey books so that she could read them. I just pictured this little Japanese girl sitting very primly reading Zane Grey books. And of course, we know, if we ever watched MASH, that Colonel Potter's favorite author was Zane Grey. So the name lives on. I have a couple of things that I wanted to mention to you. If you are very interested in the life of Zane Grey, and it would be the unvarnished life of Zane Grey, I can recommend a biography that I would consider the definitive biography of Zane Grey. And your library here has, I believe, several copies of it in hardback and possibly in paperback. This can be had, we sell this at our museum, but this can be had through Amazon. And it's very, very well written. It's very readable, despite the fact that it's scholarly. And I know it looks huge, but only 310 pages of this is text, and the rest is citations and documentations. So if you read it here, it's as truthful as it's going to be. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out is that these novels, and they're of varying degrees, or they're to varying degrees of interest depending upon what is it you like about Zane Grey. This one is called The Vanishing American. It is kind of hard to come by. We've gone on Amazon and really haven't been able to find it, but we have people who donate collections all the time. And when they come in, we kind of hoard them for a little bit, the Vanishing American books, because and one of the things about Zane Grey's novels is you can tell his attitudes and his concerns because his characters have those attitudes and concerns. This one is, it really supports the condition and the situation of Native Americans at the time that Zane was writing. Some people did not look favorably at Native Americans, but Zane did. Well, you know, he traveled in the West and he met a lot of them, and he was sympathetic to their plight, because at this time, Native American children were still being taken away from their families and sent to boarding school to become, to have improved lives, to become Christian, and so on. He and the Bureau of Indian Affairs didn't get along very well. This one, The Lost Wagon Train, I brought this one. This one's a little bit different. The adventures in this one are a little bit more exciting, I guess you'd say. And I brought these two because of their cover art. And one of the things that I was going to mention, or that I had mentioned, is that at the time that these books were written, was around the time of the Depression, and people who were artists and musicians didn't really have much of an income or much of a chance for an income. And so if you were an artist and you were willing to do dust jackets for the Zane Grey books, you got paid pennies. You really didn't make much money. And you didn't even get your name on the art, which is very, very sad. The last thing that I wanted to mention, and I brought this, Walter J. Black was a publisher who set up a book club to sell Zane Grey books monthly. It's like Book of the Month Club. If you signed up, you could get one of these mailed to you once a month. And the quality of the book isn't good. The paper isn't wonderful, and so it wasn't costly. It was very inexpensive to be a member of this book club, and postal rates were such that it wasn't expensive to have the book shipped to you either. Lots and lots of these were sold. This one happens to be Riders of the Purple Sage, and this is the book club, or the book discussion topic for next Saturday. So again, if you're interested, you can pick up a copy here at the library and read it, and we'll be hosting you and giving you a nice tour if you want to show up. Thank you. Did you want to do?
Yeah. Anybody have any questions while we're passing these out?
I'd like to know more about her interest in Zane Grey. What does she do at the museum?
Well, I guess you could say I site manage and cashier 2 days a week during the season. I give tours. And by the way, if anybody is interested in setting up a tour, if you have visitors from out of town and you'd like to entertain them, we take tours off season by appointment. And so I do that.
How did you get interested in him?
How did I? I volunteer. I started volunteering at the museum, and so I wanted to learn as much as I could because I wanted to be knowledgeable when people came in. And so that's how I ended up finding out as much as I did. And I'll be honest with you, I am not a fan per se of his writing, except for maybe 4 books that I've read that I've been lucky enough to decide that I liked, that had something really important to say. But I'm telling you, as a person, he was a character. He really was. He was a my way or the highway guy. And I know when you hear me say that, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, well, you do it my way or you get out. And but instead, it was very quiet. You do it my way or I'm out of here. He had some dispute in Payson, Arizona, about hunting rights. He wanted to hunt certain animals. They said no. So he had a cabin there and everything. He just gathered up everything and hit the road, headed over to Catalina Island off the coast of California, and joined a fishing club. Well, they were glad to get him because he was famous. He was a famous fisherman as well as a famous author. And he didn't want to mess around with some of the fish they were catching. Oh no, he wanted the big guys. So he said, I propose that we go for really, really big fish. Now they were called the Tuna Club, and tuna are a pretty big fish. But he wanted to go for swordfish, and in order to do that, he needed a heavier line, a heavier fishing line. Well, they thought about it for 2 minutes and they said, thanks for your ideas, but no. Well, what do you think he did? Just packed his family up and off he went to Altadena, California. That's near Los Angeles. And he set up his studio there. And so he was just that kind of person. His attitudes, his outlook on life, just real interesting. Not flat like some of his characters are.
You said he changed the way he spelled his name because of legal things?
There was a scandal. There was a family scandal. When he was 17 years old, his family had to leave Zanesville. And they moved to the Columbus area. And the scandal is referenced in the biography, but they don't specifically say what it was. Now, I will tell you, Zane really liked the ladies. He really did. And he was involved in a paternity suit when he was a young man, and his father was able to pay $300 to get him out of it, to get it resolved. And I'm not sure if that's the scandal or if it was a scandal. I think his dad had some financial problems, maybe. So I'm not sure what the scandal was. But I don't know that if you had a name like Pearl, just changing one vowel in your last name was going to make a real big difference. But, you know, maybe so. Okay. Well, I'll tell you, I hope your trip has been worth the while in this weather. And come and see us.
Thank you.
Thank you.